Okay, we're going to have a look at some ratios here. So what is a ratio? Well, a ratio is used to compare quantities of the same kind that do not have units of any kind. When you write a ratio, the order is important. Now, I'm going to explain this in just a minute. Now, ratios can be written in fractional form or as a percentage. I don't like this fractional form as much to actually write them, but we do use fractions later down the line to help us solve some other problems with ratios. So we'll come back to this, but I'm going to show you in a minute why I don't like writing them as fractions straight up. And then before they are written, they must be converted to the same units so you can take away the units. So this will make sense as well, coming up to here, saying that they don't use units of any kind, but I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. And the last thing is simplified ratios must contain only whole numbers. Now, you might be asking, well, okay, I've just told you a whole bunch of facts about ratios, but what does it actually mean? Well, let's have a look at this. So, if I have a question like this, and it asks me, what is the ratio of crosses to noughts? So, I've got this little diagram at the top here, and you can see I've got some crosses and some noughts, and someone's clearly won here, so good on them. Now, the way I would write that as a ratio, as it's asking me is, well, let's look at our rules here. So one of the things is they compare quantities of the same kind. So this is fine because it's not different things, it's just crosses and noughts. It's we're not comparing two completely different things. But we can't have any units for starters, okay, so I'll make sure I don't have any units. And here it says order is important. So let's look at the order in the question. I said, what is the ratio of crosses, I underline that in blue, crosses to noughts? Okay, so let's keep that in mind. And the rest of it here we don't really need to think about right now. Well, let's have a look. How many crosses are there? Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4. So to start my ratio off, I'm going to write 4. Because, going back to the order, it's asked crosses to noughts. And I have 4 crosses here, so I'm putting that there. So now when we write a ratio, what we do is put our 2 dots in the middle. And that signifies that it's a ratio. Okay? And now it's asked crosses to noughts. So let's count the noughts. 1, 2, and 3. Alright. And there we go. We've actually just written our ratio of crosses to noughts. And what this is saying is, for every 4 crosses in here, there are 3 noughts. 1, 2, 3. For every 4 crosses here, there are 3 noughts. What that also means is, we've looked at 7 things in total. Okay, 4 crosses and 3 noughts. Makes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we've looked at 7 things in total. Yeah? Let's have a look down here at noughts to empty spaces. Well, what's our first thing we're counting? We're counting noughts. So we've got 1, 2, and 3 noughts. Alright, now let's show that it's a ratio. The 2 little dots to empty spaces. Okay, well, let's count our empty spaces. We have 1 and 2. So our ratio there is 3 noughts and 2 empty spaces, or for every 3 noughts we have up in here, there are 2 empty spaces. Now let's apply this to a question like this. So if you get a question asking you to say, well, say the question was, rewrite the following statement as a ratio, so 7 millimeters to 1 centimeter. So he wants us to rewrite this here as a ratio. Well, one thing in our rules here, well, it says that before ratios can be written, they must be the same units. Now we have 2 different units here. We have 7 millimeters and 1 centimeter. Now, one of our other rules is they must be whole numbers to be a true ratio. or a true simplified ratio, sorry. So what am I going to do here? Well, I'm going to convert this 1 centimeters over to millimeters. So what I would do in this instance is say 7 millimeters. I'm still going to write 2 here. 10 millimeters, because 10 millimeters is, there's 10 millimeters in 1 centimeter. Okay, so now I check, do I have the same units? Yes, I have the same units. So now I can go ahead and actually write my ratio. So for 7 millimeters, I could put my 2 dots in to signify it's a ratio. That's 10, okay? So our ratio ends up being just 7 to 10. Remember, no units at all. And that is how you would write that as a ratio. Now, I'm going to go back to show you another example here using shapes. Now, this is why when I'm writing things as a ratio, I don't like using fractions. Now, fractions come in very handy later when we want to look at proportion and things like that. However, this is why we write ratios the way we do. So if I was to write, for example, a ratio of blue circles to red triangles, okay? Well, the first one I said there was blue circles, so let's go blue circles here, there's 3 of them. Okay, now I'm doing a ratio, so I put my 2 dots in, so red triangle, so 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? So I have a ratio of 3 to 4. Now, you can write this as a fraction. So let's just have a look. I could also signify this as like that, and we will be doing that later on. However, this differs a little bit in meaning. Unless you're using this specifically for something, your ratio should always end up looking like this. Now the reason that is because, as I mentioned before, we have 3 blue circles and 4 red triangles, but it means that we have 7 things total that we've actually had a look at there, okay? Now if you remember when we're looking at fractions, this bottom number here represents the whole amount, and this top number represents the part. So fractions come in handy later, but when you're asked to write a ratio, always remember that you need to write it in this way, even if you've been working with fractions a little later down the line to solve some problems. You should always end up writing it as a ratio here, because a ratio signifies that we have 3 of something and we have 4 of something, so we have 7 total. But if you left it as a fraction, well, you're actually saying I have 3 parts out of 4 things, but you can see here we actually are dealing with 7 things. But that's a little intro on how to write ratios. It's pretty simple. Just make sure you keep in order of what the question asks. Put your little dots in the middle to signify it's a ratio. Make sure they're in the same units before you convert it. And hey presto, you can write ratios.